Please be seated. Sitting is open. For reasons duly made known to me, Judge Sabatinde and Judge Bandari will not sit with us in these oral proceedings. The Court meets today under Article 74, Paragraph 3 of the Rules of Court to hear the oral observations of the parties on the request for the indication of provisional measures submitted by the Republic of Armenia in the case concerning application of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, Armenia versus Azerbaijan. This morning, the Republic of Armenia will present its single round of oral argument. In line with the approach adopted by the Court with respect to its public sittings, the present hearing will take place in person. However, taking into account the current public health situation in relation to COVID-19, a number of seats have been made available for members of the diplomatic corps and guests, as well as for members of the public. In addition, all those present in the Great Hall are required to wear face masks at all times, except when speaking on the floor. I'll now recall the principal steps of the procedure in the present case. On 16 September 2021, Armenia filed in the registry of the court an application instituting proceedings against Azerbaijan concerning alleged violations of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which I shall refer to as the CERD. To found the jurisdiction of the Court, Armenia invokes Article 36, Paragraph 1 of the Statute of the Court and Article 22 of CERD. The application also contains a request for the indication of provisional measures pursuant to Article 41 of the statute and Articles 73, 74, and 75 of the Rules of Court. By an order of 7 December 2021, the Court, having heard the parties, indicated the following provisional measures. I quote, "The Republic of Azerbaijan shall, in accordance with its obligations under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, A, protect from violence and bodily harm all persons captured in relation to the 2020 conflict who remain in detention and ensure their security and equality before the law. B, take all necessary measures to prevent the incitement and promotion of racial hatred and discrimination, including by its officials and public institutions, targeted at persons of Armenian national or ethnic origin. And C, take all necessary measures to prevent and punish acts of vandalism and desecration affecting Armenian cultural heritage, including but not limited to churches and other places of worship, monuments, landmarks, cemeteries, and artifacts. And 2, both parties shall refrain from any action which might aggravate or extend the dispute before the court or make it more difficult to resolve." End of quote. By an order dated 21 January 2022, the court fixed 23 January 2023 and 23 January 2024 as the respective time limits for the filing of a memorial by Armenia and a counter-memorial by Azerbaijan. By a letter dated 16 September 2022, Armenia, referring to Article 76 of the Rules of Court, requested the modification of the first provisional measure set out in the order of 7 December 2021. By an order dated 12 October 2022, the court found that, I quote, "The circumstances as they then presented themselves to the court were not such as to require the exercise of its power to modify the measures indicated in the order of 7 December 2021. End of quote. In addition, the court reaffirmed the provisional measures indicated in its order of 7 December 2021, in particular the requirement that both parties refrain from any action which might aggravate or extend the dispute before the court or make it more difficult to resolve. On 28 December 2022, Armenia submitted a new request for the indication of provisional measures, referring to Article 41 of the statute and to Article 73 of the Rules of Court. In its request, Armenia states that on 12 December 2022, Azerbaijan, I quote, orchestrated a blockade of the only road connecting the 120,000 ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh with the outside world, thereby preventing anyone and anything from entering or exiting." End of quote. It adds that this blockade, I quote again, "is ongoing as of the date of the present request." End of quote. Armenia states that the blockade has, I quote, "rendered impossible the transfer of critically ill ethnic Armenians hospitalized in Nagorno-Karabakh to medical facilities in Armenia for urgent medical care, as well as preventing the import of food, medical, and medicine supplies and other humanitarian assistance into Nagorno-Karabakh, and causing ethnic Armenian families to be forcibly separated." End of quote. According to Armenia, provisional measures are necessary in order to preserve and protect rights enshrined in CERD. By a letter of 26 January 2023, the agent of Armenia transmitted to the court the text of a further provisional measure sought by the applicant with regard to, I quote, "the provision of natural gas and other public utilities to Nagorno-Karabakh." By a letter dated 27 January 2023, Azerbaijan stated that Armenia did not have a sufficient reason for waiting until one business day before the hearing to introduce a new topic, and that it would be unable to respond to the substance of the new request during the oral proceedings scheduled for 30 January 2023. In view of the short period between the filing of Armenia's request for the indication of a new provisional measure on 26 January 2023 and today's hearing, the Registrar has informed the parties that Azerbaijan may offer any initial response to the new request during today's oral proceedings, and that Azerbaijan would be also authorized to submit written comments limited to the new provisional measure requested no later than 3 p.m. on Wednesday, February 1st. The parties have also been informed that no further additional written materials related to the pending request for the indication of provisional measures may be filed without prior authorization. The Registrar will now read out the provisional measures which the government of Armenia is asking the court to indicate. You have the floor, Mr. Registrar.
Armenia respectfully requests that the court indicate the following provisional measures. Azerbaijan shall cease its orchestration and support of the alleged protests, blocking uninterrupted free movement along the Lachin corridor in both directions. Azerbaijan shall ensure uninterrupted free movement of all persons, vehicles, and cargo along the Lachin corridor in both directions, and Azerbaijan shall immediately fully restore and refrain from disrupting or impeding the provision of natural gas and other public utilities to Nagorno-Karabakh. End of quote. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the Registrar. Immediately after the request for the indication of provisional measures on 28 December 2022 was filed, the Deputy Registrar transmitted an original copy thereof to the government of Azerbaijan. He also notified the Secretary General of the United Nations. According to Article 74, Paragraph 1 of the Rules of Court, a request for the indication of provisional measures shall have priority over all other cases. Paragraph 2 of the same article states that the court shall proceed to a decision on the request as a matter of urgency. This imperative must, however, be balanced with the need to fix the date of oral proceedings in such a way as to afford the parties an opportunity of being represented at the hearings. Consequently, the parties were informed that the oral proceedings, during which they could present their observations on their request for the indication of provisional measures, would be held on Monday, 30 January, starting at 10 a.m. I would now like to welcome the delegations of the parties. I note the presence of the two agents, accompanied by members of their respective states' delegations. This morning, the court will hear Armenia, which has submitted the request for the indication of provisional measures. It will hear Azerbaijan this afternoon at 4 p.m. For purposes of this single round of oral argument, each of the parties will have available a 2-hour sitting. In this first sitting, Armenia may, if required, avail itself of a short extension beyond 12 noon today in view of the time taken up by these introductory remarks. Before giving the floor to the agent of Armenia, I wish to draw attention of the parties to practice direction 11, which states as follows. In the oral proceedings on the request for indication of provisional measures, parties should limit themselves to what is relevant to the criteria for the indication of provisional measures as stipulated in the statute, rules, and jurisprudence of the court. They should not enter into the merits of the case beyond what is strictly necessary for that purpose. I now give the floor to the agent of Armenia, His Excellency, Mr. Yehishe Kerakosian. You have the floor, sir.
Madam President, distinguished judges of the court, it is an honor to appear before you today to speak on behalf of the Republic of Armenia, which obviously has an interest in the fate of ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. We do not come to you lightly and had hoped that the matters addressed in our request would be resolved long ago through the intervention by the UN Security Council on 20 December 2022, as well as bilateral exchanges and letters to the court since then. But Azerbaijan appears intent on strangling the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, no matter the human cost. One person has already died from lack of medical care, and numerous others are at risk of a similar fate. Grocery store shelves are empty, and food is being rationed. There are shortages in essential medicine and medical supplies. Trade and businesses have completely stopped. Gas has been repeatedly shut off entirely, and demand on the electrical grid has led to recurring and prolonged blackouts. The schools and kindergartens remain completely shut down. Children have been separated from their families 50 days now. Despite the mounting cost of this humanitarian disaster of its own making, Azerbaijan has sought to justify and perpetuate its blockade on a basis of an environmental fiction that no one believes. It does so despite its unequivocal commitment under the trilateral statement of 2020, November, to guarantee safe movement of citizens, vehicles and cargo in both directions along the Lachin corridor. And it does so in the face of near unanimous international condemnation, including from the EU, the Council of Europe, United States, France, and numerous other states, as well as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and countless other independent observers and organizations. Over a month ago, the European Court of Human Rights ordered Azerbaijan to take all necessary measures to ensure safe passage of seriously ill persons in need of medical treatment in Armenia, and those stranded on the road. And yet, Azerbaijan ignored the Strasbourg court as well, prompting it to take the extraordinary step of notifying Azerbaijan's non-compliance to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. I therefore appear before you in this great hall of justice as a last resort. If the court does not act quickly, the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh will be faced with an impossible choice: to leave their ancestral homes or to stay there and starve. President Aliyev has made that plainly clear. he has explicitly demanded that ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, quote, leave, end of quote. He has stated that Azerbaijan's, and I quote, main duty was to expel the Armenians from our lands, end of quote. He has stated that no songs will be sung in the alien language of Armenian, and that from now on, it will be the Azerbaijani language that will dominate this land. The blockade and the gas and electricity shutdowns and disruptions are specifically designed to make that happen. In President Aliyev's words just days ago, and I quote, if someone does not want to become our citizen, then the road is not closed, but open. They can go, or they can leave by themselves. No one will stop them. Or they can leave under the owning of peacekeepers' trucks, or they can go by bus. End of quote. In other words, ethnic Armenians may not enter Nagorno-Karabakh, but they may leave. Judges of the court, such blatant acts of ethnic cleansing have no place in modern era. And this court is the last hope for the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. Madam President, judges of the court, with your permission, Armenia's distinguished counsel will now take the floor to present the remainder of Armenia's case. First, Mr. Lawrence Martin will address the facts justifying Armenia's request. Second, Professor Linos Alexandros Sicilianos will address the prima facie jurisdiction of the court, the rights for which protection is sought, and the link between such rights and measures requested. Third, Dr. Konstantinos Saloronidis will address the irreparable prejudice and urgency requiring indication of provisional measures. Fourth, Professor Pierre Dargent will discuss the provisional measures requested. Finally, I will briefly return to the floor to read Armenia's submissions. I thank you, Madam President, distinguished members of the court, for your attention and careful consideration of Armenia's request. I now ask that you call Mr. Martin to the floor. Thank you.
For his statement, and I now invite Mr. Lawrence Martin to take the floor.
Madam President, distinguished members of the court, good morning. It's a privilege to appear before you today on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. As the Honorable Agent just said, we come before you today to request your urgent intervention to end an ongoing humanitarian catastrophe. Since 12 December last year, the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh has been almost entirely cut off from the outside world. They have been, and they continue to be, deprived of access to food, medicine, and all the other necessities of life. Without swift action by the court, their lives are in danger. My intervention this morning will focus on the facts justifying Armenia's request for provisional measures. It'll be divided into three parts. First, I will describe the essential facts of the blockade and the context in which it is occurring. Second, I will discuss the dire humanitarian consequences that Azerbaijan's actions are having. Third, I will address Azerbaijan's excuses about why it is not responsible for the situation and show why none of them is credible. So, to the blockade and the relevant context. The court will recall that tens of thousands of ethnic Armenians were forcibly displaced from territories conquered by Azerbaijan during the 44-day war in 2020. Not a single person has been able to return to their home. When the war ended, the Russian Federation sent peacekeepers to the region to, and these are the words of the Federation Council decree authorizing the deployment, quote, prevent the mass death of the civilian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, end quote. Even so, Azerbaijan has been doing its best to make the lives of the remaining ethnic Armenians in the region intolerable. It has attacked Armenian villages in violation of the ceasefire agreement. It has forcibly displaced residents, including all Armenians from the villages of Parukh, Berdzor, Agavno, and Sus. It has intimidated and killed Armenians who just happened to be going about their lives near its armed forces. And it has repeatedly cut off access to gas, mobile communications, and internet. Azerbaijan has always been blunt about its objective. Speaking at the opening of a new residential complex for veterans and their families in Baku in May 2022, for instance, President Aliyev said, and I quote, "Our primary duty was to expel the Armenians from our lands," end quote. And this is a man, you will recall, who was fond of calling Armenians dogs, vandals, savages, and barbarians. Even more chilling is the postage stamp issued in late 2020 by Azerbaijan's state-owned stamp company. It is on the screen now. We showed this to you during the previous hearing on provisional measures. You see the image at the top. It depicts a person in a hazmat suit disinfecting Nagorno-Karabakh. Evidently, Azerbaijan considers Armenians in the region as in need of eradication. After the war, around 120,000 ethnic Armenians are left in Nagorno-Karabakh. They are connected to Armenia and thus to the outside world by a single tenuous thread, the Goris-Stepanakert Highway, running through the Lachin corridor. You can see that on the map on the screen now, which we show for illustrative purposes. There are no roads open to Armenian civilians connecting Nagorno-Karabakh with Azerbaijan. It is also impossible to fly there because Azerbaijan has threatened to shoot down any aircraft that attempt to use the Stepanakert airport. The highway is thus the only means of transporting anything and anyone into and out of Nagorno-Karabakh. Under the trilateral statement brokered by the Russian Federation that ended the 2020 war, Azerbaijan is specifically required to, quote, guarantee safe movement of civilians, vehicles, and cargo in both directions along the Lachin corridor. Before the blockade, Nagorno-Karabakh imported some 400 tons of essential goods every day. Likewise, residents needing medical treatment elsewhere or wishing to travel outside Nagorno-Karabakh for any reason had to take this road. Then, 50 days ago, on the morning of 12 December, a group of Azerbaijanis dressed in civilian clothes and claiming to be, quote, eco-activists occupied a segment of the Goris-Stepanakert Highway near the city of Shushi, which has been under the control of Azerbaijan since the end of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. These ostensible activists claim to be protesting allegedly harmful mining activities in Nagorno-Karabakh and prevented vehicles from passing. It was a poor cover story from the very beginning. Nobody really believes the protesters are genuinely concerned about the environment in Nagorno-Karabakh. One real Azerbaijani environmental activist posted on Facebook the very day the blockade started that, quote, "It is clear as the sky that the protest of the, quote, environmental activists in Karabakh is a made-up story. Until today, I have not seen a single person there caring at all about environmental issues. These guys are just executives of a custom-tailored spectacle." An independent Azerbaijani news source interviewed a number of the protesters. Only a tiny fraction represented environmental organizations. In point of fact, many represent NGOs funded either by the Azerbaijani government or the Haydar Aliyev Foundation. Social media also abounds with photos of so-called protesters wearing military uniforms. In fact, one of the alleged leaders of the so-called protesters, Mr. Telman Kazimov, is reported to be an officer of Azerbaijan's military special intelligence service. The wholly fictitious nature of the protesters' environmental concerns is also shown by other facts. Just 2 days after the blockade started, the authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh relented to the protesters' demands that international observers be allowed to monitor the 2 mines allegedly at the center of the protests. They adopted a resolution specifically authorizing Russian and Azerbaijani observers. Azerbaijan did not accept. And a couple of weeks later, the authorities ceased mining operations in the 2 mines altogether. The blockade continues nevertheless, with no end in sight. Azerbaijanis also have far worse environmental problems, much closer to home to worry about. Oil and gas exploitation in the country has had devastating environmental consequences, including in the Caspian Sea. But somehow, the Goris-Stepanakert Highway is the only place these alleged activists choose to protest. Moreover, shortly after the blockade began, the protesters started adding demands that had nothing to do with their putative environmental concerns and had a distinctly more sovereign character. They insisted, for instance, that border and customs control posts be established on the roadway. They also spend far more time chanting slogans praising the Azerbaijani military than raising their voices about environmental issues. The chant, quote, "The Azerbaijani soldier is the greatest soldier," is one of their favorites. So what's really going on here? It's obvious. Azerbaijan is trying to fulfill what President Aliyev called its, quote, "primary duty," to expel Armenians from its lands. How do we know that? Well, President Aliyev himself said so. Speaking about the situation on the highway in a 10 January 2023 interview, he told the assembled press, quote, "Whoever does not want to become our citizen, the road is not closed, it is open. They can leave whenever they want. No one would stop them. They can travel in the back of the peacekeepers' trucks or take a bus. The road is open." The road is open for those who want to leave. Azerbaijan's purpose could not be clearer. The racial animus of the protesters themselves is equally evident. There are numerous photos and videos on social media of the protesters displaying the hand gesture of the notorious pan-Turkic ultranational group, the Grey Wolves, which is widely condemned for anti-Armenian violence and hate speech. On the screen now is just one such photo. Another video on Twitter shows protesters enjoying what is obviously a chartered bus ride to the site, merrily singing a song. The lyrics include, quote, "Let those..." At the end of the video, one grinning passenger proudly makes the same gray wolf's hand gesture, as you can see on the screen now. Protesters' social media accounts also frequently contain the vilest forms of hate speech. Our provisional measures request contains many of these examples. For now, I will cite just one to illustrate the point. This image is from the Facebook account of one so-called protester. It shows a patch depicting the notorious Ottoman genocidaire Enver Pasha with the inscription, "Armenian, don't run. You'll die anyway, just exhausted." The steps Azerbaijan has taken to expel Armenians from their homeland are not limited to blockading the Gori-Stepanakert highway. It is making their lives intolerable in other ways, too. It has cut the supply of natural gas, essential to heat homes and businesses, during the coldest months of the year. The court may recall that last year, Azerbaijan twice cut off the supply of gas, only to restore it as soon as Armenia brought it to the urgent attention of the court. Now, just since the start of the blockade, Azerbaijan has interrupted the gas supply on 5 different occasions. On December 13th for 3 days, on January 17th for 1 day, on January 18th for 3 days, and again on 21 January for 3.5 days. On 25 January, there was a brief respite. At around 11 a.m., a 48% increase in the flow of gas was reported, providing some measure of relief, but not nearly enough to meet the needs of the population. After the gas was fully restored on January 26, it was once again cut on January 29th. Bear in mind that all of this is happening during winter, when temperatures regularly fall below 0 degrees Celsius. That is not all. On 9 January, Azerbaijan appears to have damaged the only high-voltage power line connecting Goris and Stepanakert, leaving the population of Nagorno-Karabakh without a steady electricity supply. Azerbaijan, again, is not allowing Armenian technicians to repair the damage. Currently, the only available electricity comes from the limited local sources, including from the Sarsang Reservoir, which has been placed under great stress. This has entailed 6-hour rolling blackouts per day. As things stand, even longer daily blackouts seem likely to be imposed in the future. I come then to the second part of my intervention, the humanitarian consequences of Azerbaijan's actions. These are not hard to imagine. The Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh is, as I said, approximately 120,000 people. This includes 30,000 children and 20,000 elderly. The population is essentially the same as the city of Leiden with students. What would happen to the people there if it were essentially walled off from the outside world for 50 days, with only the most minimal trickle of goods allowed in and gas and electricity supplies cut off? No great leap of imagination is required to answer that question. In our written request filed at the end of last month, we focused significant attention on critically ill Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh who required treatment in Armenia but were trapped in Nagorno-Karabakh. Since then, thanks only to the urgent intervention of the ICRC, around 50 patients have been transferred to Armenia. Nevertheless, as the agent said, one person has already died. More than 10 children remain in the neonatal and intensive care units of the Children's Hospital, and a similar number of adults are in the intensive care unit. Their lives thus continue to be at risk without needed medical care. The blockade has also separated many families. More than 1,000 civilians from Nagorno-Karabakh were either in Armenia or en route to Armenia when the blockade began. About 50 children were left without parental care when their parents were stranded in Armenia. One mother was separated from her 8-month-old baby for weeks. Of those trapped in Armenia, 270 were children attending the Junior Eurovision Song Contest, about 70 without their parents. Many still have not been able to get home and are living temporarily in Goris or Yerevan. Those that have been able to go home have only been able to do so with the intervention of the ICRC. As I said before the blockade, some 400 tons of essential goods, including food and medicine, were imported to Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia on a daily basis. Only a small fraction of that is now getting through, either on Russian peacekeeping trucks or with the ICRC. Now, 50 days on, the situation is critical. Grocery store shelves are empty and pharmacies are running out of medicine. On the screen now, you can see a photo from an international press report of the situation. And this was taken more than 2 weeks ago. Things are so dire that the authorities have had to institute a rationing system. As of 20 January, residents must use vouchers for limited supplies of essential products like sunflower oil, eggs, dairy, rice, sugar, buckwheat, and pasta. The authorities have also had to tap into their wartime reserves to meet the needs of their population. In addition, the lack of gas and electricity means that people have been left without heat and the ability to prepare food. It has also impacted health care, with many urgent treatments, planned surgeries, laboratory tests, and physical examinations having to be canceled or postponed. As goods and fuel run out, economic life is also grinding to a halt. As of 20 January, hundreds of businesses are closed and thousands of people are out of work. And all 117 schools in the region have been closed since 20 January. In light of the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe, calls for Azerbaijan to lift the blockade have come from all across the international community. By way of example only, on 19 January, the European Parliament overwhelmingly passed a resolution expressly taking note of the danger the people of Nagorno-Karabakh are facing and calling on Azerbaijan to end the blockade. Specifically, the resolution states, among other things, quote, "The blockade has led to a severe humanitarian crisis, significantly affecting the most vulnerable populations. Whereas the transfer of critically ill patients is nearly impossible, with one death resulting from this situation. Whereas hundreds of families remain separated, and this humanitarian crisis was further aggravated by Azerbaijan's disruption of the natural gas supply to Nagorno-Karabakh, which left houses, hospitals, and schools without heating. Accordingly, the resolution, quote, deplores the tragic humanitarian consequences of the blockade of the Lachin corridor in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and urges Azerbaijan to respect and implement the trilateral statement of 9 November and immediately reopen the Lachin corridor to enable free movement and ensure access to essential goods and services, thus guaranteeing security in the region and safeguarding residents' livelihoods. The EU Parliament's call fell on deaf ears in Azerbaijan. That brings me, Madam President, to the last part of my presentation this morning. Faced with these stark and widely condemned facts, what does Azerbaijan say? Not much, actually. We look forward to hearing what it has to say later today, but we expect it will be much of the same. For now, I will address what little we have to work with. I will start with what it has said to this court. In its first letter to the court dated 3 January, Azerbaijan presented what it called its initial response and promised to provide more information later. Azerbaijan first asserted the road, quote, is controlled by Russian Federation peacekeepers in application of the trilateral statement, not Azerbaijan. This assertion, of course, entirely overlooks the fact that in paragraph 6 of the trilateral statement, Azerbaijan specifically undertook to, quote, guarantee safe movement of citizens, vehicles, and cargo in both directions along the Lachin corridor. Azerbaijan's assertion also overlooks the fact that the alleged protesters are its own citizens, who can only be there because it was only recently conquered by Azerbaijan with the express permission of the government. Indeed, Azerbaijan's own evidence proves the point. Annex 14 to its letter, submitted last Tuesday, is a collection of NGO requests for authorization from the Office of the President to protest at the site. Having given the protesters permission to be where they are, President Aliyev can just as easily take it away. Azerbaijan next claimed that, quote, protesters are not blocking the road and that the Russian Federation peacekeepers are allowing the passage of residents, essential medical services, and humanitarian supplies on the Lachin Road. Orwell's line about rejecting the evidence of your eyes and ears seems apposite here. Literally no one in the world outside of Azerbaijan actually believes that protesters are not blocking the road. On 13 December, the Russian peacekeepers reported that, quote, on 12 December, the Azerbaijani side blocked the Stepanakert-Goris road. On the screen now is another picture taken from the site. If this is not blocking the road, I don't know what it is. Nor does anyone believe that vehicles are getting through freely. Just recently, the UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, called, quote, for free and safe movement through Lachin corridor to be immediately and fully enabled, saying, quote, unrestricted access to food, medicine, and other basic goods and services is essential to the enjoyment of human rights of the affected population. If vehicles were truly passing freely, why would the ICRC or the Russian peacekeepers each time have to negotiate with the Azerbaijanis blocking the road in order to get critically ill patients out of Nagorno-Karabakh to get the medical care they need? And why would it be necessary for the ICRC and the Russian peacekeepers to be the ones to deliver the few meager supplies that are getting through? The evidence Azerbaijan cited to support the assertion in its letter about the road not being blocked is contained in a single footnote that lists 3 sources. The first is an article from Azerbaijani state media reporting on the passage of just 3 ICRC vehicles. The text of the article is revealing, and in a way that is not helpful to Azerbaijan. Remember, this is from Azerbaijani state media. It says, quote, today, conditions were created for the passage of 3 vehicles belonging to the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, on the Kekendi-Lachin Road. The participants of the action pulled out of the road and opened a corridor for the passage of cars. The participants of the action pulled out of the road and opened a corridor for the passage of cars. In other words, they temporarily lifted the blockade just so 3 ICRC vehicles could pass. The 3 January letter also referred to a tweet from a senior government official with an embedded video showing protesters, quote, standing aside, so again, lifting the blockade to let 3 ICRC vehicles pass. And the only other so-called evidence is a self-serving statement to the Security Council by Azerbaijan's permanent representative to the UN. In its 3 January letter, Azerbaijan also alleged that, quote, Armenia willfully and unlawfully has been using the Lachen Road to traffic weapons, including recently laid landmines and booby traps that continue to kill and maim Azerbaijanis, and illegally mined minerals between Armenia and Azerbaijan's sovereign territory, end quote. We will have a lot more to say about that claim tomorrow. Today, let me simply say that there is not even a shred of evidence to support it. Nothing. It is also worth recalling that the road has been under the supervision of the Russian peacekeepers since November 2020, and that not a single one of their daily bulletins has reported the alleged transport of weapons, landmines, or minerals. In its second letter to the court, dated 12 January, Azerbaijan did not really offer any more information as it said it would. It does little more than repeat the contents of its first letter, saying that, quote, the Lachen Road is controlled by Russian peacekeepers, and Azerbaijan does not exercise control over who is using the road in either direction, and that, quote, vehicles continue to pass next to the protest site unimpeded, end quote. As I have largely dealt with these assertions, I will not repeat myself. I just note that whereas its first letter contained only a single evidentiary footnote about the passage of vehicles, its second letter contains 8. Still, they add nothing. The 8 footnotes are all references to Azerbaijani state media reports, all of which mention only Russian peacekeeping or ICRC vehicles passing the site after negotiation with the Azerbaijanis. I'm sure we'll hear more of the same this afternoon. But the point is, these special exceptions for outside parties with special responsibilities only serve to prove the rule that the road is not open as usual. Outside the court, Azerbaijan has sometimes tried a different approach, claiming the protests are a simple manifestation of its people's right to protest. In a 23 December 22 statement, for example, the Azerbaijani Ministry of Foreign Affairs referred to the, quote, peaceful protest on Lachen Road with a demand to prevent the illegal exploitation of Azerbaijani's natural resources, the transportation of these resources from Azerbaijan to Armenia, and the abuse of the Lachen Road, the use of which is intended only for humanitarian purposes, end quote. There are a number of problems with this pretense. First, even if it were true that the protests really were private individuals who were genuinely concerned about the environment, which, as I explained, it distinctly is not, that would not justify their actions or Azerbaijan's failure to disperse them. Any right to protest would be outweighed by the grievous harm inflicted on the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. The Azerbaijani government could not be justified in leaving the protesters alone, given that very real harm. The claim that these are just spontaneous manifestations of private discontent is also put to the lie by the fact that Azerbaijan is not a free country in which public protests are tolerated. Freedom House, for one, has ranked Azerbaijan as, quote, not free, in part because of a lack of freedom of assembly. In a 2022 report, it wrote, quote, unsanctioned assemblies can draw a harsh police response and fines for participants. This assembly, in contrast, is plainly sanctioned, indeed staged, by the government. Azerbaijan's excuses regarding the interruptions of gas and electricity are equally unconvincing, indeed entirely contradictory. According to documents Azerbaijan submitted last Tuesday, on 15 December, the Azerbaijani Minister of Foreign Affairs claimed that Azerbaijan had no control over the gas supply, saying, quote, "The gas supply in the said areas is carried out by Armenia, and that those areas are not integrated into the supply system of our country," end quote. Only 4 days later, on 19 December 2022, in a letter from the permanent representative of Azerbaijan to the UN, Azerbaijan tried a different excuse for the disruptions, blaming, quote, "technical reasons, including bad weather conditions currently observed in certain mountainous regions of Azerbaijan," end quote. It then said, "Due to immediate steps taken by Azerbaijani authorities, technical problems have now been fixed, and as of now, gas supply in the area is resumed," end quote. It said much the same thing in a letter to the court last year about earlier disruptions, writing that, quote, "employees of Azerigas worked on site to restore service, which was fully restored by 28 March, end quote. So does Azerbaijan have control over the gas supply, or doesn't it? Azerbaijan can't seem to get its story straight. In truth, there really can be no doubt that Azerbaijan does have full control over the gas supply. How do we know? President Aliyev himself said so. Speaking in the aftermath of gas disruptions in the spring of 2022, President Aliyev boasted, "If we didn't want to, we wouldn't restore the gas supply. Who can tell us anything? Did we owe them to restore it? No." At the end of the day, the reality of what is happening is painfully simple and brutally clear. The ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh are under siege. For those who choose to stay, their only access to the outside world is blocked. Everything else they need to continue living where they have for millennia is rationed or gone already. This includes food, medicine, heat, and electricity. The cover story Azerbaijan came up with to mask its actions is pure fiction. The alleged eco-activists conducting the blockade are nothing of the sort. They have no genuine environmental pedigree and are a mixture of government-funded private citizens and government and military personnel, all united by a deep, long-taught hatred of Armenians. They are there with the government's support and approval to advance the government's agenda, to make life unbearable for the ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. The government of Azerbaijan could put an end to the blockade before I finish this speech, if it wanted to, but it has no interest in doing so. An order of the court is therefore required as a matter of urgency. Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the court, may I ask that you invite Professor Sicilianos to the podium.
I thank Mr. Martin, and I now invite the next speaker, Professor Linos Alexander Sicilianos, to address the court. You have the floor, Professor.
Madam President, distinguished judges, it is an honor to appear before the court and to do so on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. I will be addressing three issues: the prima facie jurisdiction of the court, the plausibility of the rights whose protection is sought, and the link of those rights with the measures requested. The first point, concerning the jurisdiction of the court, does not need an extensive analysis. In its order of 7 December 2021, on the indication of provisional measures in the present case, the court concluded that prima facie it has jurisdiction pursuant to Article 22 of CERT to entertain the case to the extent that the dispute between the parties relates to the interpretation or application of the Convention. This conclusion applies as well to the present request. The plausibility of the rights whose protection is sought. The Court, at this stage of the proceedings, is not called upon to determine definitely whether the rights which Armenia wishes to see protected exist. Rather, it need only decide whether the rights claimed by Armenia on the merits and for which it is seeking protection are plausible and whether the provisional measures requested are linked to these plausible rights. The Court has found the plausibility condition to be met when the asserted rights are grounded in a possible interpretation of the treaty in question. In other cases, under the Convention, the Court has also examined whether it is plausible that the acts complained of constitute acts of racial discrimination. The present request seeks the preservation and protection of a number of rights under Articles 2 and 5 of CERT for the benefit of ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. As it was amply demonstrated by my colleague Mr. Martin, those rights are being infringed by Azerbaijan's blockade and related measures which target ethnic Armenians because they are Armenians. The CERT prohibited discriminatory purpose of Azerbaijan's conduct is obvious from the simple fact that the only human beings benefiting from the Lachin corridor or the public utilities in question are ethnic Armenians. It is moreover indisputable that the disastrous effects of the blockade and related measures are inflicted entirely on ethnic Armenians. In other words, the blockade and related measures are patently discriminatory acts on ethnic grounds. As such, they fall squarely within the scope of application of the Convention as defined in Article 1, Paragraph 1. I shall refer to the plausibility of the rights Armenia invokes under Article 2 of the Convention, and then to the plausibility of rights under Article 5 of the Convention. Rights under Article 2 of the Convention. According to the CERT Committee, and I quote, Article 2 is a comprehensive provision addressing all aspects of states parties' obligation to pursue a policy of eliminating discrimination. The provisional measures request of Armenia invokes particularly the general prohibition of discrimination contained in the chapeau of Article 2.1, together with subparagraphs A, B, and E. The chapeau of Article 2.1 provides that states parties condemn racial discrimination and undertake to pursue by all appropriate means and without delay a policy of eliminating racial discrimination in all its forms and promoting understanding among all races. The specific contribution of this provision is to lend a heightened sense of urgency to the Convention. Subparagraph A prohibits discrimination by the state itself, including public authorities and public institutions. According to this provision, each state party undertakes to engage in no act or practice of racial discrimination. As the Court has observed, Article 2.1 accordingly contains an obligation to engage in no act or practice of racial discrimination against persons, group of persons, or institutions. There is no doubt that the blockade of the Lachin corridor and related measures contradict the general prohibition of discrimination contained in Article 2.1. As already underlined, the blockade is discriminatory in nature. It has both the purpose and effect of impairing the enjoyment and exercise by ethnic Armenians of their human rights on an equal footing with other ethnic groups. This blockade must also be seen against the background of Azerbaijan's conduct since its commencement of the 44-day war, which was unequivocally designed to force Armenians to leave. In this context, the CERT Committee has most recently expressed concern about, and I quote the committee, allegations of severe and grave human rights violations committed during the 2020 hostilities and beyond. The committee has also highlighted last August its concern in relation to incitement to racial hatred and the propagation of racist stereotypes against persons of Armenian national or ethnic origin, including by public figures and government officials, end of quotation. This racial hatred and the propagation of racist stereotypes has a distinct purpose: to ethnically cleanse all ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. No ethnic Armenian remain in any of the territories of Nagorno-Karabakh conquered by Azerbaijan during the 44-day war. No ethnic Armenian remain in territories returned to Azerbaijan after the conclusion of the 44-day war. I recall the statement by President Aliyev referring to Armenians in the Lachin corridor. When did you come here? In 1994. Who lived here before then? Azerbaijanis did. So leave. End of quotation. The Armenians did leave after this threatening statement. The blockade is yet another important step fitting squarely in this policy of intimidation. It is aimed at creating living conditions so unbearable for ethnic Armenians that they are forced to leave this area. I recall this statement by President Aliyev, dated 10 January 2023. Whoever does not want to become our citizen, the road is not closed, it is open. They can leave, they can go by themselves. No one will hinder them. The road is open. The road is thus open only into one direction. This is the quintessence of the presidential statement. In its memorial, Armenia fully substantiates the myriad wrongful acts constituting ethnic cleansing. In the present context, it suffices to stress that the blockade and its clear and overt purpose, as recently stated by President Aliyev himself, are fully integrated into this long-standing policy of ethnic cleansing. As recognized by the court, the term ethnic cleansing is used to mean rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of given groups from the area. The practice of ethnic cleansing encompasses a wide range of underlying acts, including acts of intimidation, for instance, through the creation of adverse living conditions. The Third Committee itself has affirmed that practices of ethnic cleansing constitute a grave violation of all the basic principles underlying the CERT. This is especially true in relation to the general prohibition of racial discrimination enshrined in Article 2.1 of the Convention. Seen in its context and against its background, the blockade is the very negation of the obligation to engage in no act or practice of racial discrimination against persons, group of persons, or institutions, in our case against ethnic Armenians. 2.1b shifts the emphasis from discrimination by the state itself towards discrimination by actors backed by the state. Under this provision, states parties undertake the obligation not to sponsor, defend, or support racial discrimination by any persons or organizations. Regarding the verbs in the subparagraph, sponsor overlaps with support and may be understood in terms of taking responsibility for the acts of another. Support has a wider meaning and may include encouragement, assistance, or approval. In the above-mentioned interview of 10 January 2023, President Aliyev explicitly supported and even defended the blockade and the so-called eco-activists by declaring, I quote, "First of all, I salute those young people. They are a source of our pride. They have been there day and night in freezing and snowy weather, demanding their rights, and once again showing the whole world the high moral qualities of Azerbaijani youth." End of quotation. As my colleague Mr. Martin has amply demonstrated, many of the so-called eco-activists are not private individuals, and all such eco-activists are supported by the government. Such support is clearly incompatible with the obligation of states parties under Article 2(1)(b) of CERD not to sponsor, defend, or support racial discrimination by any persons or organizations. Article 2(1)(e) now insists on the obligation of states parties to encourage integration, to eliminate barriers between races and ethnic groups, and to discourage racial division. However, the above statements of approval and support of the blockade and the so-called eco-activists are the negation of the obligation to discourage anything which tends to strengthen racial division under Article 2(1)(e) of the CERD. It is indeed more than plausible that the encouragement of the blockade of a whole ethnic community perpetuates segregation, thereby strengthening division along ethnic lines. In conclusion on this point, the blockade and its support and encouragement constitute plausible and even manifest breaches of the obligations and the corresponding rights under Article 2(1), subparagraphs A, B, and E of CERD. I turn now to Article 5 of the Convention. This provision is expressly linked to Article 2. It tends to ensure the effective implementation of the general prohibition of discrimination. Among the rights named in Article 5, the provisional measures request of Armenia, as supplemented on 26 January 2023, invokes particularly subparagraph D1 on the freedom of movement, subparagraph D2 on the right to leave and return, including family reunification, and subparagraph E4 on the right to public health, medical care, social security, and social services. I shall examine the plausibility of those rights one by one. Article 5(d)(1) protects the equal enjoyment of the right to freedom of movement. This provision is inspired by Article 13(1) of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This right should be enjoyed without discrimination based inter alia on ethnic or national origin. It is evident that the blockade of the Lachin corridor precludes ethnic Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh from moving freely. They are confined in a very limited space, which is the only space in Nagorno-Karabakh where they are allowed to live. Article 5(d)(2) protects the equal enjoyment of the right to leave any country, including one's own, and to return to one's country. This right draws upon Article 13(2) of the Universal Declaration and is found in other international instruments, including Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Both aspects of this right, the right to leave, and more importantly in this context, the right to return, are the subject of an extensive general comment by the Human Rights Committee. According to this authoritative interpretation, the freedom to leave the country may not be made dependent on any specific purpose. Furthermore, restrictions to the right to leave must be provided by law, must serve a legitimate aim, and must be necessary in a democratic society for the protection of this aim. As explained by the Human Rights Committee, the right of an individual to enter his or her own country recognizes the special relationship of a person to that country and includes the right to remain and the right to return, as well as the right to be reunited with family. The right also implies prohibition of enforced population transfers or mass expulsions to other countries. A fortiori, the right to return implies the prohibition of practices of ethnic cleansing. The persons entitled to exercise the right to return to his or her own country can be identified by interpreting the meaning of the phrase his own country. According to the Human Rights Committee again, the scope of his own country is broader than the scope country of his nationality. It embraces the individual who has special ties to or claims in relation to a given country. In other words, what matters is the factual relationship with the country, irrespective of any question related to nationality or citizenship. The blockade of the Lachin corridor creates a situation which blatantly violates the freedom of movement implied in the right to leave and the right to return to one's country. This blockade is not provided in any law. It is arbitrary. It does not serve any legitimate purpose and, of course, is not necessary in a democratic society. As Mr. Martin has amply demonstrated, families remain separated, given that the blockade was imposed when more than 1,000 civilians of Nagorno-Karabakh were either already in Armenia or en route to Armenia. Among other things, when the blockade was imposed, a large number of ethnic Armenian children living in Nagorno-Karabakh had been attending a contest in Armenia. Some of them were able to return on 19 January 2023, escorted by the Russian peacekeepers. But Azerbaijanis stopped the vehicle and intimidated the children. This grave incident has been largely documented. It clearly demonstrates the obstacles to the right to return, even when escorted by the Russian peacekeepers. Without them, it is simply impossible to return. In conclusion on this point, the blockade of the Lachin corridor, whose purpose is discriminatory, is a clear and in any case a plausible violation of the provisions of the CERT concerning freedom of movement, namely Article 5D, subparagraphs 1 and 2. I continue now with social rights, and more particularly with the right to public health, medical care, social security, and social services, protected in Article 5E4 of the Convention. The statement of protected rights in this subparagraph incorporates rights listed separately in other UN documents, especially in Articles 9 and 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights concerning the right to health and the right to social security, respectively. According to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the right to health is visualized as related to and dependent upon the realization of a range of other human rights and is understood as a right to the enjoyment of a variety of facilities, goods and services. The CERT Committee has not adopted the general recommendation on Article 5E4. However, a broad understanding of this provision clearly results from different group-related general recommendations and numerous concluding observations. The rights protected in Article 5E4 have been clearly violated because of the blockade. For 50 days now, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh remain under siege. The daily newsletters issued by local authorities report the increasing number of critically ill ethnic Armenians hospitalized in Nagorno-Karabakh who have been slated to be transferred to medical facilities in Armenia for urgent medical care, but for whom the blockade has rendered their free and timely transfer impossible. One of them has already died. Another patient suffering from brain cancer was prevented from undergoing a scheduled surgery last December. When he was finally allowed to exit Nagorno-Karabakh, it was too late for the treatment. Any medicine coming in requires negotiations upon negotiations for Azerbaijan to approve the delivery by the International Committee of the Red Cross or the Russian peacekeepers. The Ministry of Health of the Republic of Artsakh has warned that local hospitals could soon face a shortage of medicine and other life-saving medical supplies. Hundreds of ethnic Armenians have been deprived of the right to receive necessary medical treatment due to the suspensions of planned surgeries in medical facilities across Nagorno-Karabakh. The blockade is also preventing the import of food and other humanitarian assistance in Nagorno-Karabakh. As Mr. Martin explained, prior to the blockade, approximately 400 tons of essential goods, including grain, flour, vegetables and fruits, were imported into Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia on a daily basis. Now, due to the discriminatory blockade, there are critical shortages in these essential goods. The authorities were forced to introduce the rationing of food and essential goods through a coupon program. Supermarkets and grocery stores are left with empty shelves. Again, any food coming in requires negotiations upon negotiations for Azerbaijan to approve their delivery by the ICRC or the Russian peacekeepers. With the dearth of food currently in Nagorno-Karabakh, it is truly disheartening to see tons upon tons of goods stored in Armenian border towns awaiting a window of opportunity to be sent to their beneficiaries. In a resolution on the humanitarian consequences of the blockade in Nagorno-Karabakh, the European Parliament has qualified this situation as a severe humanitarian crisis. Timed to coincide with the blockade, on 13 December 2022, Azerbaijan once again cut off the supply of natural gas to Nagorno-Karabakh without any advance warning, leaving homes, businesses, hospitals and schools without heat in the midst of a freezing winter. Medical facilities were forced to suspend scheduled surgeries to save energy and medicine. All schools that use natural gas for heating were shut down. The streets of ethnic Armenian settlements emptied, with local gas stations supplying fuel only to ambulances, public buses and other authorized vehicles. As Mr. Martin explained earlier, the supply of natural gas was restored on 16 December, but since mid-January 2023, it was repeatedly interrupted again and again. As stressed by the European Parliament, this humanitarian crisis has been, I quote, further aggravated by Azerbaijan's disruption of the natural gas supply to Nagorno-Karabakh, which left houses, hospitals and schools without heating. End of quotation of the European Parliament. Furthermore, the deliberate and repeated interruption of the gas supply in freezing winter conditions is combined with the ongoing disruptions of the electrical grid and telecommunication lines in the entire territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. This severely impacts the daily life of the people and leads to a number of adverse humanitarian consequences, such as lack of electricity, disruption of the educational process in schools, disruption of the heating of vitally important institutions such as hospitals, and disruption of businesses. People are deprived of heating and hot water. The authorities were forced to introduce the rationing of fuel. In an effort to save electricity, rolling blackouts were implemented for each household for 6 hours per day. In a report released on 23 January 2023, the Human Rights Ombudsman of Artsakh presents facts regarding the widespread and large-scale violations of the rights of the people of Artsakh due to the deliberate disruption of the normal functioning of Artsakh's vital infrastructures. Such disruption put the civilian population in front of a humanitarian disaster. In conclusion on this point, the blockade and related measures entail a series of more than plausible violations of social rights protected under Article 5(e)(4). In this connection, may I observe, Madam President, distinguished judges, that the CERT contains a much broader spectrum of rights than the European Convention on Human Rights, which was the basis of the provisional measures ordered last December by the European Court in Strasbourg. Let me briefly turn now to my final point, the link between all the above rights under Articles 2 and 5 of CERT and the measures requested. The provisional measures requested are obviously linked to the rights whose protection is sought, because the measures, if indicated, would safeguard these very rights. Indeed, lifting the blockade of the Lachin corridor and ensuring uninterrupted free movement of all persons, vehicles and cargo along the corridor in both directions would mean the end of the siege of Nagorno-Karabakh, the end of the unbearable living conditions of ethnic Armenians in violation of Article 2.1 of the Convention, lifting the blockade, ensuring free movement along the Lachin corridor, as well as restoring and refraining from disrupting or impeding the provision of natural gas and other public utilities to Nagorno-Karabakh, would also put an end to a series of discriminatory measures in violation of Article 5 of the Convention. More particularly, it would put an end to the intimidating measures against ethnic Armenians related to the blockade. It would permit the enjoyment of the various aspects of their right to free movement. It would also ensure access of those in need to hospitals and medical care, access to basic goods, food, electricity, and natural gas. In a nutshell, the measures requested, if indicated, would permit 120,000 ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh to live again in decency. Otherwise, there is an urgent risk of irreparable damage. May I kindly ask you, Madam President, to give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Konstantinos Salonidis, who will be addressing this issue. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank Professor Sicilianis for his statement, and I now invite Mr. Konstantinos Salonidis to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Madam President and distinguished members of the Court, good morning. It is an honor to appear before you on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. It falls to me today to address the circumstances underlying the ongoing irreparable harm that Azerbaijan's actions have been inflicting on the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh for the last 50 days. I turn first to the existence of irreparable prejudice in the present case. The Court, pursuant to Article 41 of its statute, has the power to indicate provisional measures when irreparable prejudice could be caused to rights which are the subject of judicial proceedings, or when the alleged disregard of such rights may entail irreparable consequences. My apologies. In all prior cases concerning possible violations of the CERD, the Court has found rights under Article 5 of the CERD to be of such a nature that prejudice to them is capable of causing irreparable harm. For example, in the case brought by Georgia against Russia under the CERD, the Court held that violations of the right to freedom of movement could cause irreparable harm in situations where the persons concerned are exposed to privation, hardship, anguish, and even danger to life and health. In the case brought by Qatar against the United Arab Emirates under the CERD, the Court found that prejudice can also be considered as irreparable when, inter alia, and I quote, individuals are subject to temporary or potentially ongoing separation from their families and suffer from psychological distress, and when students are prevented from taking their exams due to enforced absence. Through the present request for provisional measures, Armenia is seeking to protect rights of ethnic Armenians under Articles 5b, 5d, and 5e, Roman numeral 4, together with those rights arising from the general prohibition of racial discrimination under Article 2. In circumstances where Azerbaijan has put into jeopardy the security of 120,000 people, deprived them of freedom of movement and their rights to be with their families and loved ones, their rights to receive food, medical care, education, heat, and electricity amidst the freezing winter, there is no reason for the Court to revisit its established approach to the nature of the rights under Article 5 of the CERD, or that of the potential prejudice to them. I turn to the final condition for the indication of provisional measures, namely urgency. The Court has made clear that it will indicate provisional measures, quote, only if there is urgency in the sense that there is a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice in case there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused before the court gives its final decision. So what has happened in these 50 days of blockade? And does it meet the requisite urgency for the exercise of the court's power? Let us recall the essential facts. As the blockade took shape on 12 December 2022, hundreds of people were stranded on the blockaded road in cold winter conditions. Over 1,000 who had been visiting family, attending school or events, or conducting business away from Nagorno-Karabakh were instantly cut off from their homes and families. This included approximately 270 children. At the same time, as Mr. Martin recalled earlier, the daily flow of 400 tons of essential goods into Nagorno-Karabakh immediately came to a halt, as did the transfer of the critically ill to Armenia for urgent medical treatment and scheduled medical examinations. On day 2, amidst freezing winter temperatures, the gas supply was interrupted. As it did last March, Azerbaijan did not allow emergency crews to investigate and make necessary repairs. The interruption persisted for 3 days until, under mounting international pressure, the flow of gas was restored. On day 8, the blockade claimed its first life when a 44-year-old hemodialysis patient in serious condition was not permitted to seek treatment outside Nagorno-Karabakh. On the same day, all non-emergency surgeries in all hospitals in Nagorno-Karabakh were suspended due to the anticipated shortages in medical supplies. By day 10, grocery store shelves had been emptied of fresh food staples. Bakeries were running out of ingredients to make bread. By day 11, pharmacies were running out of antibiotics, blood pressure medication, insulin, and other essential medicines and medical supplies. By day 15, cash shortages led to the imposition of withdrawal limits at banks. On day 23, local authorities decided that due to the impossibility of importing food and essential goods with regularity, state wartime reserves would need to be distributed. On day 28, food shortages led preschools and kindergartens across Nagorno-Karabakh to close their doors. It has now been more than 3 weeks since the youngest children have been out of school. On the same day, the only high-voltage power line connecting Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia was damaged in an apparent act of sabotage. As a result of the blockade, Nagorno-Karabakh technicians were denied access to the site. The electricity supply has not been stable since. By day 36, the transmission of natural gas had fallen to a fraction of its normal flow. According to Nagorno-Karabakh engineers, this suggested that Azerbaijan had intentionally adjusted the valve to reduce supply. On day 37, for the second time during these 50 days, the supply of natural gas was completely cut off around noon local time, only to be restored at 5 p.m. and then cut off again at 9 p.m. That same day, 4 hours of rolling blackouts per day were introduced in order to cope with the dwindling supply of electricity. The electrical grid was already at a reduced capacity due to the downing of the main electrical power line on day 29. Naturally, in the absence of a consistent flow of natural gas, the electrical grid is even more overwhelmed, as people turn to electrical heating sources to cope with the lack of gas. On day 39, all 117 schools in Nagorno-Karabakh were closed indefinitely due to the shortage of gas and electricity supplies, which affected naturally tens of thousands of children. The supply of natural gas remained cut off. On day 40, the gas supply was resumed. To alleviate the pressure on the electricity grid, it was, however, decided to increase rolling blackouts across Nagorno-Karabakh from 4 to 6 hours a day. The same day, a coupon rationing system for essential foodstuff came into effect. On day 41, at around 8 p.m. local time, the gas supply was cut off yet again, marking the fourth time in a little over a month. For the next 3.5 days, the supply of gas was never more than 11% of the usual supply. This trickle of gas was barely enough to fuel ovens in bakeries and provide minimum heat in hospitals. By day 44, grocery stores in Nagorno-Karabakh had been emptied of almost all products. Baby formula became a scarce commodity. By day 45, commercial gas stations across Nagorno-Karabakh had to shut down as the dwindling gas was diverted to healthcare institutions and bread production facilities. On day 46, over 250 tons of humanitarian aid destined for Stepanakert remained in warehouses in Goris, unable to be transported across the blockade. Appeals to the residents of Stepanakert started to appear on social media, calling them to evacuate, which were dismissed by local authorities as an attempt by the intelligence service of Azerbaijan to spread panic among the population. On day 47, local authorities began distributing firewood and wood-burning stoves to residents. The gas supply was partially restored on that day, but supplied only to the residents of Stepanakert, given the demands on the impaired energy system. On day 48, the gas supply was once again cut off. The gas supply appears to have been restored on the eve of this hearing. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, this is where we stood as of 24 hours ago. The situation remains precarious as we enter today, day 50. To see this firsthand, you may find at tab 2 of your judges' folders the English versions of some of the very bulletins that residents of Nagorno-Karabakh receive daily from the local authorities. These bulletins update them on what new cruelty Azerbaijan's actions are inflicting upon them and convey information on a daily basis on how best to cope with the consequences. As I speak before you today, over 1,000 people remain separated from their families and friends, including hundreds of children. Imagine how every minute of the past 50 days has felt for the parents of these children and the children themselves. In the past 50 days, a dozen residents of Nagorno-Karabakh have passed away, either abroad or in Armenia. Families and friends have been unable to mourn them, since their bodies cannot be transported across the blockade. The transfer of the critically ill still takes place only after negotiations with the Azerbaijani so-called protesters, conducted by the peacekeepers or the ICRC. The so-called protesters truly hold power over the life and death of these individuals. Chemotherapy provided in cancer clinics across the border has become impossible to obtain, meaning that patients have been without treatments for 7 weeks now, their chances of recovering from cancer slowly dissipating. By now, hundreds of planned surgeries have been indefinitely suspended. Hospital wards cannot be heated sufficiently to meet the bare minimum safe temperature of 14 degrees Celsius. There are serious shortages in essential foodstuff and medicine, with the small quantities allowed to pass being distributed to the most vulnerable and not even coming close to the needs of the broader population. And it is the same with baby formula. The flow of gas was restored on the eve of this hearing. It remains to be seen for how long. Rolling electricity blackouts remain necessary to sustain the viability of the electricity network. Instead of attending school, thousands of children sit at home without electricity for 6 hours a day, with an empty pantry, and some of them with the heat of only a wood-burning stove. The impact of all this on their development is too obvious to state. Virtually all economic activity has been suspended. The closure of the highway has made the import and export of products and materials impossible, causing the shutdown of commercial and manufacturing businesses. At least 5,000 have lost their jobs. Despite international calls, humanitarian organizations and United Nations agencies still cannot reach the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, any suggestion that this situation can be addressed through the trickle of supplies that is allowed to go in is cynical. The same is true of any suggestion that emergency and routine medical care of 102,000 people should be contingent on negotiated ICRC transfers as if in a time of war. Nothing short of a full lifting of the blockade and unhindered resumption of the provision of public utilities will bring relief to the victims of this unnecessary and cruel blockade. And in this conclusion, Armenia is not alone. This conclusion is shared by the international community at large. As you can see on your screens, calls abound for Azerbaijan to immediately and fully end the blockade and to urgently guarantee unimpeded access. This is necessary in order to avert humanitarian catastrophe, the risk of which grows each day. Following Azerbaijan's failure to respect the interim measure ordered by the European Court of Human Rights, the President of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe similarly expressed her, quote, concern about the increasingly precarious humanitarian situation, end quote, of the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, and, quote, called on the relevant authorities to quickly restore freedom of movement along the corridor in order to avoid the further deterioration of the situation. And yet we heard from Mr. Martin that such calls fall on willfully deaf ears. Azerbaijan brags openly about how it cannot be stopped, not by the international community, and not even by a binding order of the court in Strasbourg. Madam President, distinguished judges of the court, the progressive deterioration of the situation is obvious, as is the collective trauma already inflicted on the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. With respect, these circumstances do not just entail an imminent risk of irreparable harm. They are causing such irreparable harm in real time, with the scope, scale, and gravity of the harm compounding with each passing hour. The Court has previously granted provisional measures to protect rights under the CERD after finding that the affected populations remain vulnerable. The people of Nagorno-Karabakh are not just vulnerable, they are enduring for 50 days now a humanitarian crisis, and I'm afraid they will continue to do so without the Court's urgent intervention. This concludes my presentation. I thank the Court for its attention and respectfully request, Madam President, to ask Professor Darzant to take the floor.
I thank Mr. Salonides, and I now invite the next speaker, Professor Pierre Darzant, to address the floor. You have the floor, Professor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, it's an honour to take the floor before you at the end of this morning on behalf of Armenia. My colleagues have put to you the facts and the law to justify you exercising your power under Article 41 of the statute. And I will now move on to the concrete measures that Armenia is requesting from the court, and I will underline why these are necessary as they've been set out. Now, the facts before you are of the utmost seriousness. It's neither more nor less than the taking of hostage of 120,000 people, rendering their life impossible, unbearable, and then bring them to their knees, depriving them in midwinter of all essentials, solely because they are members of the Armenian national and ethnic group. The obvious aim of this operation, orchestrated and supported by the Azerbaijani regime, is to give notice to the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh that they are at their mercy, to discourage them, to make them fed up with living where they were born, where their ancestors lived for centuries, to cause the massive exodus of those who haven't already left subsequent to the war of 2020. That's the perspective that President Aliyev openly espouses. Now, you will have heard him, you would have read him. He declared 20 days ago, if those besieged and surrounded Armenians want to leave, let them do it. The road will be open to them. Now, Madam President, distinguished members of the court, as you've been able to note since the filing of the initial Armenian application, the usual reaction of Azerbaijan to any accusation against it is to be offended, to issue wholesale denials and then start accusing in return. Distinguished members of the court, Azerbaijan can vituperate as much as they want. Nobody believes in their environmental fairy tale. Nobody believes in the so-called activist initiative of civil society in a country which is notoriously autocratic. Nobody believes that this has been the fault of the Russian Federation. Nobody believes that the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh would be free to come and go, and that foodstuffs would arrive in sufficient quantity like before, that families will be able to meet freely, and that ill people will be transported without restriction. Free press doesn't believe it. Foreign governments don't believe it. The European Court of Human Rights didn't believe it. The committee, subsequently, of ministers of the Council of Europe didn't believe it either, nor did the Parliamentary Assembly of the same organisation or the European Parliament. These important documents are all in your judges folder under tabs 3 through 7. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has called the full re-establishment of freedom of movement in the Lachin corridor the only way to ensure that the elementary rights of the population affected will be respected. Of course, this means the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Finally, the major NGOs equally decried the humanitarian urgency. The corridor is allegedly open in both directions, but do you realise, distinguished members of the court, what you have to do right now is to organise a convoy of the ICRC, of the Russian Federation peacekeeping forces, and solicit their agreement to transport towards Yerevan sick people, the most seriously sick people, whose care cannot be ensured by the hospital in Stepanakert. And the same applies for the trickle-through transport of foodstuffs or any sort of essential daily goods. All the while hoping, of course, that the so-called protesters see fit to move off the road when the convoy approaches. Depends on their mood, doesn't it? It depends, of course, on instructions they're receiving from Baku. Distinguished members of the court, Azerbaijan is besieging Nagorno-Karabakh quite simply because the Armenians want to continue to live there, and that the and that Azerbaijan cannot bear this. Nagorno-Karabakh has to change its name, has to change its culture, and all trace of secular Armenian presence must be denied. In a word, Nagorno-Karabakh has to change its people. Karabakh is Azerbaijan, as the so-called eco-activists chant in chorus. This, the very official slogan directed by a fur-clad dignitary shaking a white dove in his hands until it falls dead on the ground. Karabakh is Azerbaijan. That's a slogan, a territorial slogan. It's a territorial and ethnic slogan. It means that the Armenians have no place in Nagorno-Karabakh. The facts speak for themselves, and the efforts of Azerbaijan to deny them or to denature them are as unworthy as they are in vain. Your court is the final guardian of the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Azerbaijan signed up to it, but acts to the contrary, even if the environmental pretext were true, but we know it's baseless. Even if it was true, it must still bow to the imperatives of the Convention. Indeed, you don't save nature or natural resources by preventing 120,000 people from eating or being given urgent care. And this all the more so when this violation of elementary human rights, by its purpose and effects, targets individuals on grounds prohibited by the Convention. The road blocked since 12 December, only serves the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. It was given protected status by the agreement of November 2020 precisely for this reason. But Azerbaijan seeks to have you believe that its blockade is in no way discriminatory. But, distinguished members of the court, to see through Azerbaijan's plan, you really have to ask yourself two simple questions. Why staged a so-called demonstration precisely here? Why do it in midwinter? And why for 50 days already with no end in sight? Distinguished members of the court, Azerbaijan, has remained deaf to the numerous appeals of the international community to end its blockade so that the highway be open for use once again as it was before 12 December. Azerbaijan dismissed the provisional measures ordered by the ECHR, nor did it comply when the Committee of Ministers quite exceptionally enjoined it to do so. Your court has to act, and you must act swiftly. If you do not indicate the provisional measures, quite soon there will be no more Armenian men and women in Nagorno-Karabakh. They will have fled their mountains to save their life, as President Aliyev invites them to do. If you don't indicate measures that are perfectly clear and bare of ambiguity, Azerbaijan will exploit the least loophole to achieve its sinister ends using some other subterfuge. Finally, if you don't indicate measures, not only for now but the future, everything shows that Armenia one day or another will be obliged to call on you with urgency once again. Madam President, the first provisional measure which Armenia requests is Azerbaijan shall cease its orchestration and support of the alleged protests blocking interrupted free movement along the Lachin corridor in both directions. Armenia is not asking you to order Azerbaijan to disperse by force those so-called demonstrators, because given the trilateral agreement, it's not for Azerbaijan to deploy security forces on the road along the corridor. However, it is vital that Azerbaijan immediately ceases the orchestration and support, financial, logistical or otherwise, of any protest blocking or hampering free movement in either direction along the corridor. Armenia also requests you to order that Azerbaijan, I quote, shall ensure uninterrupted free movement of all persons, vehicles and cargo along the Lachin corridor in both directions. End of quotation. This second measure is complementary to the first and equally necessary. It is important that Azerbaijan be given a positive obligation giving effect to the undertaking it accepted by the November 20 trilateral agreement, whose exact terms my colleague Mr. Martin recalled to you, and which Azerbaijan has breached in a manner perforce discriminatory. Azerbaijan would not have made such an undertaking were it not capable of assuming it. Armenia is not asking you to do the impossible. It is asking you something which makes good sense, common sense. It's the only way to preserve those rights of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh severely under threat in violation of the Convention. In the absence of such a measure, those inhabitants will be constantly at the mercy of the Baku government. Just lifting the current blockade will not be enough. It must also be ensured that in future, Azerbaijan will not be able to close the road or render it impracticable on one pretext or another. Distinguished members of the Court, you will have noted that the measure requested concerns the uninterrupted free movement of all persons and vehicles, as well as the free movement of cargo. There are no grounds to restrict the second measure to persons, vehicles and cargo of a humanitarian nature, because the enjoyment of rights under the Convention is not subject nor limited by humanitarian requirements. Moreover, the ordinary needs of a civil population clearly far exceed simple humanitarian necessities. Finally, to target humanitarian convoys alone would encourage Azerbaijan to quibble and to use the humanitarian limitation on its obligation to argue time after time that no such need actually exists, or that the convoy fails in some way or another to comply with this condition. Madam President, the third and last measure requested by Armenia concerns the uninterrupted supply of energy, indispensable, to a dignified life. Armenia had been obliged to add this request on Thursday because the gas supply was once again abruptly cut off, once again after our request dated 28 December, whereas it had been re-established just before. My colleagues Martin and Salonidis gave you a detailed factual chronology of this and the alleged excuses of Azerbaijan. It's got to stop. Of course, Azerbaijan, as is its wont, responded immediately to the third provisional measure requested by Armenia, even though this measure was submitted more than 4 days before these hearings. And there's nothing untoward about this. Indeed, provisional measures, supplementary provisional measures, have been requested in other cases right up to the day before hearings and debated during those hearings. Whatever the case may be, we know what Azerbaijan will respond. It's already written down, with contradictions and a bit of confusion, but what Azerbaijan might add will remain unverifiable because Azerbaijan refuses to give access to any third party to the areas concerned. But, distinguished members of the Court, could I just dwell for an instant on the letter of Azerbaijan of 27 January where they react to our additional request for a provisional measure? Indeed, this letter reveals the discriminatory plan of the Baku government. Any government concerned about the fate of those living on what it considers to be its own territory would not have failed to understand that its responsibility is to ensure a regular supply to the inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh with the same speed and consideration as elsewhere. But there is no single sentence to this end in the letter, nor any solemn undertaking to do the best to prevent these so-called accidental shutdowns from reoccurring. In its letter, Azerbaijan does not seek to resolve a real problem, even though it does not dispute the reality of the gas being shut off. By admitting, supposing one were to admit that these cut-offs were accidental and not intentional, Azerbaijan does not intend to lift its little finger to ensure a normal and regular gas supply to the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. By its letter, Azerbaijan, quite simply, is seeking to delay your deliberations so that the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh suffer a little bit longer. But Armenia hopes, nonetheless, that your decision will be taken without delay. Distinguished members of the Court, the measures requested concern Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan alone because it's its behaviour that alone is at issue here. It's Azerbaijan that is organising, sponsoring, supporting the so-called eco-protesters. It's Azerbaijan which is violating in discriminatory fashion the obligation it assumed under the trilateral agreement, thus causing irreparable harm to the rights recognised under the Convention. It's Azerbaijan which is responsible for gas and electricity supplies from the areas under its control and thus for the ensuing breakdowns in service. Madam President, for the second time in one short year, irrefutable available evidence is once more converging, and this shows that Azerbaijan is not only tolerating but it's also encouraging and pursuing discriminatory policy against the Armenian inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh, depriving them of everything necessary for their survival with the aim of inciting them to leave their ancestral lands to escape the misery thus inflicted. In the letter addressed to you on the 12th of January, Azerbaijan characterized the victims of the blockade as, I quote, its Armenian citizens. However, Azerbaijan obstinately refuses these very Armenian citizens the rights it grants to all its other citizens, namely the right to come and go freely, the right to food, heating, health care. Whereas Azerbaijan purportedly seeks to normalize its relations with Armenia, is it too much to ask Azerbaijan to ensure that the inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh a secure existence, decent living conditions? What state treats its own citizens in this fashion? What state besieges 120,000 people of another ethnic and national origin on the pretext that its mining resources have been purloined and that this is unbearable? Distinguished members of the Court, what these so-called environmental protests supported and sponsored and organised by Azerbaijan flagrantly show is that Azerbaijan's subsoil is more valuable to it than the men, women, children and old people, Armenians, who live upon it. In this context, as fragile as it is noxious, the fierce resistance opposed by Azerbaijan to the elementary requests of Armenia make you fear the worst. And this fierce resistance should in reality be enough to convince you to act. Indeed, the provisional measures requested by Armenia, all Armenia asks you for is nothing more than to ensure that the situation which existed until the eve of 12 December be re-established. And that's not only necessary for the survival of 120,000 ethnic Armenians encircled and slowly being strangled in their mountains, but it's important for the usefulness of your judgment on the merits. It has to be done right now. Armenia counts confidently and hopefully on the wisdom of your court. We are persuaded that you will be able to pierce the smokescreen that our opponents will surely create this afternoon and tomorrow morning. I'd like to thank the Court for its kind attention, and could I request to Madam President to please call Dr. Yegishe Karakossian to the as agent for Armenia, to present the final submissions of our country.
I thank Professor Dajan for his statement, and I now invite the agent of Armenia, His Excellency, Mr. Diagishe Kirakosyan, to take the floor. You have the floor, Excellency.
Madam President, distinguished judges of the court, it is an honor to appear before you again. I shall now read Armenia's closing submissions. On the basis of its request for provisional measures dated 27 December 2022, its letter dated 26 January 2023, and its oral pleadings, Armenia respectfully requests the court to indicate the following provisional measures pending its determination of this case on the merits. First, Azerbaijan shall cease its orchestration and support of alleged protests blocking uninterrupted free movement along the Lachin corridor in both directions. Second, Azerbaijan shall ensure uninterrupted free movement of all persons, vehicles and cargo along the Lachin corridor in both directions. Third, Azerbaijan shall immediately, fully restore and refrain from disrupting or impeding the provision of natural gas and other public utilities to Nagorno-Karabakh. Madam President, distinguished judges of the court, this concludes Armenia's oral presentation of its request for provisional measures. Thank you for your attention and consideration of Armenia's request.
I thank the agent of Armenia, whose statement brings to an end the single round of oral argument of Armenia, as well as this morning's sitting. The court will meet again this afternoon at 4 p.m. to hear Azerbaijan present its single round of oral argument. The sitting is adjourned.